Last year I did a video on why I thought small watch collections were stupid. You guys gave me a lot of feedback on that, mostly positive, but some interesting ideas to consider as well. Today I'm going to do a follow-up addressing some of those ideas. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Today what I'm going to do is sort of a response to your responses, a follow-up to my video on why I thought small collections were stupid. You gave me a lot of ideas. Going through those is going to be really long, so I'm not going to do a lot of preamble. I'm going to get straight into it right now. The first thing is, a few of you said, I think in mirth, certainly BJJ Rhino summed it up best. He said he's a firm believer in a 3-watch collection, and I think he said he believes in them so much he's got many 3-watch collections. Timeless Capital said something similar, as did James Duffy. Now, I think there was someone that was, at least some of those people were kind of playing a little bit, but I think there's some truth underlying that. One of the things that many of us with larger collections kind of, whether it's a mental trick to fool ourselves into not feeling so bad, or whether it's a genuine, this is kind of how we see the world, don't think of our collections as huge, because we think of our collections as, if you like, federations of smaller collections. I only collect a couple of dive watches, a couple of pilot watches, and a couple of travel watches, and maybe I've got a couple of dress watches. So I've only got about 4 watches. But then if you go deeper, you might say I've got 3 of these and 2 of these and 4 of these. And then when you add them all up, that comes to 16, 20, 30. I think that, a lot of us don't necessarily consider the whole bunch of our watches, but rather that we think of them as chunks. And as long as there aren't too many chunks and aren't too many examples of the chunks, then we've got everything under control, which may be true, maybe not be true, might be a trick that we tell ourselves, or it might be genuinely how we think about things. But it was an interesting point. Orange Hand gave me a long comment which had a number of different points, which I've kind of sliced and diced into some different arguments. The first one was around the idea of memories. Now, Orange Hand's point was that by having a large collection where we might only wear a watch every now and then, kind of dilutes the formation of connections between you and the watch, and between you and the watch and some kind of events. I kind of agree with that. I can see where we're going, but on the other hand, I also disagree with it. What I would say is, especially from the outside looking in, having a large collection does kind of dilute the connection that people make between you and a watch. My father probably only had about 3 or 4 watches over his entire life, and for most of the time I was living at home, he had like 1. If I picture myself sitting on the front seat of the car looking across at my dad's hand on the steering wheel, I can always picture this one Seiko watch. That is his watch. And that the connection between him and that watch is kind of indelible in my mind. If he'd have had 20 watches and it was a different one every time he drove me somewhere, would that connection be there? No, it wouldn't. So from that point of view, outsiders making connections, especially outsiders making connections between you and a watch, I completely agree with Orange Hand there. Where I disagree is more when we're talking internally, and in particular if I'm trying to form a connection between me, a watch, and an event. For me, if I only have one product, one choice, in fact, if I don't even have a choice, if the thing I use, the car, the camera, the watch, the wallet, whatever, is kind of just like what I'm stuck with, I don't form any connection between me, that product, and the event I had to use it in, because I didn't have to think about it. It was a non-thinking process. No memory was formed at all. If, on the other hand, I've got a selection of watches, a couple of which are kind of dressy, then if I've got a wedding or a funeral or a graduation or a birthday to go to, and I've got to make a choice, which of these would I wear, then I have to think about it. I have to form a memory. between myself, the watch, and the event. It's no longer just an unthinking, I grab the only watch that's suitable, I put it on, I go through my day, I put it back. There's now the effort of saying, which watch am I going to pick? I think this is the one that would be suitable for this, and a memory is formed, a connection is grown. So from that point of view, if you want to get to the end and say this watch is associated with these specific memories, I think having a large collection is far superior to having the one watch that you just wear to everything, and is kind of an unthinking, unthoughtful approach. Amin from Amin Reviews had a fantastic point which really irritated me because I wish I'd thought about it for my original video. It's kind of popular in YouTube communities, in this whole hobby, to poo-poo the idea that buying watches is fun. It's seen as being too materialistic, and that's a point I'll raise later. It's seen as being a bit materialistic, a little bit superficial. But that doesn't take away from the fact it's absolutely true. Buying watches is huge fun. And Amin makes that point. The other point he makes is that selling watches is work. Selling watches is not fun. Selling watches is, at best, tedious, at worst, distasteful and frustrating and annoying, and potentially painful if you don't really want to see the back of that watch. So a large collection, almost by definition, means that you get to buy a whole lot more than you have to sell. On the other hand, if you go, God forbid, if you went down to 1 or 2 watches and had a strict 1 in, 1 out policy, then every time you get the joy of the joy of a buy, it's polluted with the pain of a sell. And yeah, that would just be horrible. So for me, I wish I'd thought about that earlier. Getting to buy so much more than I have to sell is, again, a massive advantage of having a larger collection. Which brings me to the point that Ulysses raised, another guy who had a long comment that had a number of parts, so I've sliced and diced it. He had some concerns about the inherent materialism involved in having a large collection. And I think some of what I just touched on is possibly like what's coming through there. The first thing I'd say is that if you're into watch collecting like normal people, which involves having watches, and you're prepared to spend money on those, my theory is most people will spend about the same, whether they have a lot of watches or fewer watches. It's just about the value of the watches. And if you're spending the same amount of money, you are equally materialistic. So if you've got one $20,000 watch or 10 $2,000 watches, neither one of those is more or less materialist than the other. I think Odysseus also had some concerns about my question of seeing watches as, to use my turn of phrase, little mirrors that we like, that we enjoy because they reflect back at us our best selves, the selves we wish we were, whatever. He felt that was a bit, I'm assuming Odysseus is he, sorry, I should just say they, assumed that that felt a bit, again, bit materialist, a bit, a bit crass. And that instead they preferred to simply buy watches that brought them joy. What I would say is I believe there is a very large, not entirely overlap, but a very large overlap between between those watches that reflect back at us things about ourselves that we want or wish were true or once were true, and those things that bring us joy. I don't see them as separate. In fact, I see more often than not, things bring us joy because they reflect back at us times that we remember, attributes about ourselves that we wish were true, things about the world and our place in it that we wish were true, were once true, are what we want to think about. I don't see those as separate at all. I think of the essence of time is raised an interesting question about whether having a big collection or a small collection is in some way connected to the idea of thinking that you are a watch collector as opposed to someone who simply likes watches. I'm loath to go down the line of trying to define whether someone else is or is not a collector. I think that we each, that's sort of a category I'll kind of allow each person to decide for themselves. It's not really up to me to say. What I would say though is if there is a very particular type of collector, someone who has an idea in their head that what they want to do is perhaps buy an example of a chronograph from every top company, or they want to buy an example of every version of a Submariner, or in my case, they want to have a number of watches which reflect the entire history of a brand. For me, it's Alpina. I think it would be true that that is generally going to mean you end up buying some watches that you might not personally love, but or uniquely and specifically love, but which are important to you for that collection. And that is necessarily going to mean you end up with more watches than someone who is only buying the watches that they love. I can see that argument, and I think in most cases that would probably pan out to be true. On the other hand, I could equally make the argument that someone might want to say, what's important to me is have a really carefully curated collection of the first generation of automatic chronographs. And then in which case that person only ends up buying 4 watches. I think there'll be a Hamilton Buren, a Breitling, a Tag, and a Zenith, and that's it. You got 4 watches. Whereas someone who says, I'm just going to buy the watches I really love, could end up buying 100 watches because they enjoy lots of watches. So I don't think that rule is hard and fast. However, I would agree for most people, if they're just stuck with the idea of I'm only going to buy the watches that really bring me joy today versus I'm buying a collection that is curated and records a greater theme, yeah, there probably will be a difference in the number of watches they have. And that brings me to another point, the point of money, which was raised by both Stephen S2R and also of the Essence of Time is. I think both made the assumption that I was making some kind of financial or fiscal assumptions, if you like, about how much a big collection versus a small collection would cost. I think both seem to be, in fact, it was hard to know whether they thought a big collection or a small collection was going to cost more or less than the other. The only assumption I made was that in the end, we're all going to spend about whatever we thought we would spend on our hobby. If we had a small collection, there would be the same amount of money spent on a small number of watches. If we had a large collection, you'd have the same amount of money spent on a larger collection. There was some question of the Essence of Time is raised, the idea that there's, one could be inherently, that the smaller collection could be inherently more efficient than a larger collection. I don't know if that's true. A number of the assumptions in there I would sort of question. Like if you've got a large, I sort of touched on this before, there was an assumption that they would have kind of the same number of buys and sells. I don't think that's true. I think if you've got a large collection, you'll be buying a lot of watches but selling very few. I think if you've got a small collection, you'll probably end up selling a lot more. And so there'll probably be a lot more losses on the transactions. There was an assumption that if you're selling high value, if you've got a small collection, you'll be buying more expensive pieces which are easier to sell, pass on, retain their value better than if you're buying cheaper pieces. Again, I'm not convinced that's true. Now, my history is really, really short and my experience is really, really shallow in this space. But my experience is that with a large collection, A, you don't have to sell as much in the first place, and B, with a large collection, you're not under the pressure to sell that people seem to be when they've only got small collections. And so you can afford to buy better, you can afford to sell better when you've got a lot of watches and you're not really in much of a hurry. I noticed that a lot of people with smaller collections and like strict one in, one out policies seem to be in a rush to sell and a rush to buy. And in particular, they seem to often, in that rush, end up buying and selling often the same watch over and over again. Now, I'm not going to try. And then, but on the other hand, you've got maintenance issues if you've got a large collection that you might not have with a smaller collection. On the other hand, smaller collection, higher value watches, those servicings, whilst less frequent, will be far more expensive. Where do I fall? I don't know. I think the differences in finances and which one's more efficient will be different for every single person. So I think from a money perspective, it's kind of a wash, and it really will depend on each person. And I don't think you can make a claim that one will always be more or less efficient than the other. Now, a couple of you raised questions around my idea that versatility is a path to mediocrity, the specialist versus the generalist argument. Some of the responses were clever, but kind of, I didn't see as particularly effective rebuttals to my idea. So the first one was from, for example, of the essence of time is resorted to a fictional character from a movie, the Marissa Tomei character, who was a generalist, kind of just smart person who was into cars, who then provides expert testimony and gets a guy off, who was it? I can't remember who it was. I think the kid from Karate Kid, if I remember right, off some charge in rural backwater America. In reality, that person would never actually be allowed to be an expert witness, would never be a specialist. I think that you had to resort to a fictional character probably doesn't harm my argument that much. Gustavo Stacchero said something even more interesting. Again, a really quite clever example, but not one that I think affects my argument very much, in that he not only was it not a product or a person, not even a fictional one, we're now going to the world of chemical compounds. Gustavo said that water, or clean water specifically, was an excellent example of a general use product which could occasionally be the very best product to use. Really clever, some agile mental thinking going on there. But again, given that you're talking about one of the most exceptional chemical compounds in the universe, just one of millions that can pull that trick off, I don't think it actually does my argument that a generalist watch will rarely do the job of a specialist as well, much damage. Tennessee Mike raised a really interesting point, which is worth exploring, around the notion that sometimes a generalist can be the best manager of people, the best manager of specialists. Now, this is really interesting, and I'm going to explore it more when I address what Orange Hand says later. I totally agree. I think that, and there's a great example of where the generalist on its own isn't that special, isn't that useful. However, in conjunction with specialists, it can help bring everything together. It can fill in the gaps. It can synthesize the bridges we need between the specialists that we've got. I think that's really useful. And I wish I'd thought about it earlier, because what I would say is a specialization that you could have could be to be a fantastic generalist. That in itself can be a specialization. In fact, in medicine, it is a specialization. To be a general practitioner is to be a specialist in general practice. And I think this is coming to the point that Orange Hand was raising in his comment, where he said that versatility done right can come close to perfection. Yes, I believe if you take being a generalist, being versatile, and make that the thing that you are after, then yes, I can accept the idea that you can be the perfect generalist. If your specialization is versatility, then you can be the best at that. But that you're only ever the best at being a generalist. You're never the best at being any one of those roles. I suppose I'd talk about, for example, in athletics, you might have, the world record holder for the decathlon or the world record holder for triathlon is the best generalist, is the world's best generalist, is almost perfect at being a generalist in whatever their disciplines are. I'll stick with triathlon, I know that. Swimming, riding, and running. And that is absolutely true. What I would also say, though, is that when you extract the generalist and then compare it with the specialist in any one of those fields, they get smoked. The compromises a triathlete has to make to their training, to their time management, to their body morphology, to be able to swim competitively, means that when they have to run, they will get smoked, absolutely slaughtered by a specialist runner. Conversely, the compromises they have to make for both swimming and for running means that when they get on a bike, they can be the world's fastest triathlete on a bike, but put them up against someone who does nothing but ride a bike, and they're left in the dust. And so, again, whilst I accept the idea that if we treat being a generalist as a specialization, you can approach perfection in that specialization, when you extract individual roles, you're always going to be inferior to the person who only does that. Or the watch is always going to be inferior to the watch that only does that role. And that last point brings me to the issue that a number of you raised around the question of quantity versus quality. Alex S., Mark Calvert, Blue Shirt Buddha all raised the issue of some of you said you used to think this way, but now you value quality over quantity, that sort of thing. I would, if you like, I agree with you. I also value quality over quantity. But the difference between us is we're putting the idea of value and of quantity and quality in different places. I think what you're doing is you're putting quantity into the number of watches you own, and you're thinking of quality as the quality of each watch. I'm thinking of quality in terms of how well does a watch do the function it has, and quantity as how many functions am I trying to put in a watch. So you'd look at something like a Rolex Submariner and say that's a high quality watch, which it is, which can do, and I only have one watch, therefore I have a small quantity of watches, and I have a high quality watch. I would look at that and say, you've got one watch with a high quantity of roles to do, none of which it does to a particularly high quality. An example would be, we'll stick with the Submariner. Ballpark, if I wanted to buy a Submariner right now, it'll cost me 18,000 Australian dollars. Now, some of you are going to argue, and that's not new, that's a couple of years old, reasonably good condition, boxes and papers. Now, some of you are going to argue that that's above MSRP and I should use MSRP. On a new Rolex, MSRP, planning for MSRP is like planning your retirement based on winning the lottery. It's theoretically possible, but unwise. I would treat trying to, design a strategy for normal people around being able to just walk in and buy a Rolex at retail, a Rolex Submariner at retail, is theoretically possible, but unwise. So if you're if you're in a position you've built yourself to the point where you are the preferred customer and you can do that, then everything I'm about to say is off the table, because you've got so much money that nothing I'm going to tell you makes any sense. But okay, let's stick with this. We've got a Rolex Submariner. It's a good all-round, it's potentially one of the best all-round watches. It's going to cost you about 18 grand. And let's just say, for the purposes of this argument, it's going to be your daily driver. It's widely known to be able to be pulled off as a bit of a dress watch, and it can also do it can actually also be a hardcore diver. My argument is you take that 18 grand, instead by 3 watches such as Habring 2 Felix for your dress option, say Omega Planet Ocean for your diver, and an IWC Ingenieur as your daily driver, you're ending up with watches that do each of those functions far better than the Submariner. Now, the Submariner can pull them off, absolutely. Can you wear a Submariner with a suit and use it in a kind of dressy environment? Yes, you can. Is the Habring far superior to the Rolex in doing that function? Yes, it is. And likewise, as you move down, yes, the Rolex can do those things, but the other watches, each of which costs about a third of the Rolex, does that thing way better. Now, if on the other hand, you had a fourth thing that you needed this watch to be or do, such as be a Rolex, then all bets are off. Again, if you've got this other function of be a Rolex, be a Patek, be an A. Lange & Söhne, then, as I say, all bets are off. The other watches clearly can't even provide that function. But if we're just talking about be a dress watch, be a daily beater, be a dive watch, then I think that those specializations can be provided far better by watches that cost relatively small fractions of what a Submariner does. And so that's it. That's kind of my response to your comments. Now, I'm not going to do a follow-up to the follow-up. However, I do encourage you all, if you've got thoughts and if you disagree with me or you agree with me, please tell me what you think or don't think in the comments below. Like I said, I'm not going to do a follow-up to the follow-up, but I am going to come back to this question later on, maybe next year or later this year. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.